Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I am Debbie Waidl, and today we are talking about something that affects so many of the women in the Freedom from Migraine method. We are talking about sinus issues and migraines. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front, if you have been told that you have sinus headaches or chronic sinus issues alongside your migraines, there's a really good chance that you've been misdiagnosed. Now, I know that might sound bold, but stick with me because I'm about to share what could save you from unnecessary sinus surgeries, rounds of antibiotics that don't work, and years of chasing the wrong problem. So here's what I hear all the time. Debbie, I have migraines, but I also have terrible sinus issues. My face hurts. I have pressure around my eyes and my cheekbones. My nose gets congested. I feel like I have a sinus infection constantly. And because those symptoms feel so much like a sinus problem, you go to the ENT, right? You go to a specialist. They look at your sinuses. Maybe they do a CT scan if it's that bad, and they say, yeah, looks like you have chronic sinusitis, and let's try an antibiotic, right? Sometimes they'll even do a nasal swab to confirm the infection. And guess what? The test, it comes back positive for bacteria. So you end up taking an antibiotic and maybe you feel better for a week or two, but then the symptoms come back. So they try again, more antibiotics, maybe a steroid this time. Maybe they even recommend sinus surgery to open things up and improve drainage. And here's the thing, all of that makes sense based on what they're seeing. Your symptoms do look like sinus problems. The pressure, the congestion, the facial pain, the positive bacteria test, those are all pointing towards a sinus infection. But here's what most ENT doctors don't realize. Up to 90% of people who think they have sinus headaches actually have migraines. Let me say that again, 90%. That's not me making this up. That's what the research shows. Study after study has found that when people who are diagnosed with sinus headaches are reevaluated by headache specialists, the vast majority, they actually have migraines. So what's happening? Why do migraine symptoms feel so much like sinus issues? And why do those bacteria tests come back positive if there's no actual infection? So let's talk about the actual nasal swab test for a second. Here's what most people don't know. Your nose, it always has bacteria in it, even when you're completely healthy. The nasal passages, they're not sterile. They're home to normal bacteria that live there without causing problems. So a positive sinus swab does not automatically mean that you have a sinus infection. Most swabs don't even reach the actual sinuses. They're sampling the nasal cavity where bacteria and fungi normally live. When there's inflammation from migraines, allergy, stress, or reflux, those organisms are more likely to show up on a test. The results, they look positive, but the bacteria aren't necessarily the cause. That's why so many people take antibiotics and do not improve, because the test shows bacteria and the symptoms look like a sinus infection. Because of that, it is so easy to assume the bacteria are the problem. But the real question isn't what grew on the swab, it's why inflammation is showing up there in the first place. And here's where it gets even more interesting. A lot of the time, people feel better after taking the antibiotic, so they think, see, it was a sinus infection. The antibiotic worked. But here's what's really happening. It's not the antibiotics working, it's just time passing. Migraines come in cycles. They flare up, they peak, and then they calm down, whether you take antibiotics or not. So if you start antibiotics during a migraine flare and the flare naturally resolves in a week, you think the antibiotics cured you, but the migraine was going to calm anyway. The antibiotics had nothing to do with it. And you probably were doing things during that time that reduce inflammation. You don't feel well, so you're resting a little more. Maybe you're drinking a little more water. You're doing things to care for yourself, which reduce inflammation, which brings that migraine down. So symptoms are always going to come back that are sinus symptoms when you're treating them as a sinus infection, but they're a migraine because the antibiotics are never addressing the real problem. The inflamed trigeminal nerve is what's driving your symptoms. So, how do you know if you actually have a sinus infection or if it's migraine related, right? Because people do get sinus infections. So, here are the hallmark signs of a true bacterial sinus infection. I want you to think thick, discolored mucus, yellow or green, that lasts for 10 plus days without improvement. Fever, often 100.4 or higher. Severe facial pain that gets worse when you bend forward. Very bad breath or loss of smell from the infection. Upper tooth pain, a lot of times just on one side. And symptoms that get progressively worse over days, not better. So if you have a true bacterial sinus infection, you're going to feel sick, like really sick, not just I have a headache and my face feels full. Now compare that to a migraine with sinus-like symptoms, where you're going to get that throbbing or pulsing pain, not constant pressure, where maybe you have pain on one side of your head or face, and light and sound you're very sensitive to. Maybe you have nausea or sensitivity to smell. Clear or slightly cloudy mucus, not thick and green though, right? Symptoms that come and go in the cycle. Maybe you feel better for a little while, then you feel worse, then you feel a little better, and maybe a little bit of relief when lying down in a dark, quiet room. You see the difference between the two? There's a huge difference. Now, if your sinus headaches come with light sensitivity, nausea, and throbbing pain, and if they come in waves rather than getting progressively worse, you are dealing with a migraine, not a sinus infection. So let's take a look at what's actually happening in your head so that you can understand the difference. So there's this nerve, it's called the trigeminal nerve, and it is the largest cranial nerve. It has three main branches that spread across your face. We actually have a couple other podcasts on this, so if you're interested in the trigeminal nerve, make sure you go back and look for the other podcasts that we have. If you need some help finding them, just let me know. Just send me a message and we'll send them right to you. Now, one of the branches goes to your forehead and your eyes. Another branch goes to your cheek and your upper jaw. And the third branch goes to your lower jaw. The trigeminal nerve, it is the main nerve involved in migraines. And when this nerve gets irritated or inflamed, which is what happens during a migraine, it actually sends pain signals to your brain. But it doesn't just send those signals to just one spot. Because the trigeminal nerve branch spreads across your entire face, the pain and inflammation can show up anywhere those branches go. This means pressure around your eyes and your forehead, pain in your cheekbones, facial tenderness, nasal congestion, even a runny nose or watery eyes. All of these are trigeminal nerve symptoms, not sinus infection symptoms, but they feel identical. So it's completely understandable why you and your doctor think it's a sinus problem. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. When the trigeminal nerve is inflamed, it can trigger something called neurogenic inflammation in the sinus tissue. And what does that mean? It means the nerve inflammation causes your sinus tissue to swell and produce mucus, even though there's no infection. So when your doctor does a scan, they might see inflamed sinus tissue and they think, aha, it's a sinus infection. Cool. But it's not an infection. It's nerve-driven inflammation. That's why antibiotics don't work, because there's nothing to kill. There's no bacteria causing the problem. It's inflammation from the trigeminal nerve. And that's why sinus surgery often doesn't help either, because opening up your sinuses doesn't fix the nerve that's causing the problem in the first place. You can have perfectly clear, wide open sinuses and still have all the same symptoms because the trigeminal nerve, it's still inflamed. Now, let me tell you about one of my clients, Lisa. Lisa came to me after years of what she called chronic sinus infections, right? She'd been on antibiotics 7 or 8 times in 2 years. She'd had sinus surgery. She was using nasal sprays, decongestants, you name it. And she still had facial pressure. She still had congestion. She still had headaches. And sometimes this was happening multiple times a week. And when I asked her to describe her headaches, she said they were throbbing, often on one side of her head, light and noise made them worse, and she also felt nauseous during the worst ones. Those aren't sinus headache symptoms. Those are migraine symptoms. But because she also had facial pressure and congestion, everyone, including her doctors, assumed it was her sinuses. Now, we started working together using the Freedom from Migraine method. We addressed her inflammatory network dysfunction. We dove into her inducers, her drivers, and her epigenetics. And within 12 weeks, her sinus issues were gone. No more facial pressure, no more congestion, no more constant feeling of, I'm getting another sinus infection. And why? Because we calmed the inflammation in her trigeminal nerve. And when the nerve calms down, the sinus symptoms disappeared. She didn't need more antibiotics. She didn't need another surgery. She didn't need to address the root cause. She needed to pause. She didn't need more antibiotics. She didn't need another surgery. She needed to address the root cause, chronic inflammation driving nerve dysfunction. So what's the solution? It's the same solution for all migraine-related issues. Address the inflammatory network dysfunction. Your migraines and the sinus symptoms that come with them are driven by chronic systemic inflammation. That inflammation affects your nervous system, including the trigeminal nerve. And when that nerve is inflamed, it creates those sinus symptoms. Now, in the Freedom from Migraine method, we work through the 3 phases. We work through phase 1, find your inducers. We actually identify the 6 key areas that are fueling your inflammation: nutrition and toxins, sleep, mindset, electrolytes, and movement. And when we calm inflammation in these areas, your nervous system starts to settle. And then we move on to phase 2, where we calm the drivers. So we work on addressing the deeper issues like hormones and gut dysfunction and autoimmunity or chronic stress that keeps inflammation high. And for many women, gut issues or hormonal imbalances are major drivers of nerve inflammation. And then in phase 3, we address the epigenetic influences, because some women do have genetic factors that make them more susceptible to nerve inflammation. We look at those and adjust the approach accordingly. So when you work through these phases systematically, the inflammation in your trigeminal nerve, it goes down. And when that happens, the sinus symptoms resolve. The facial pressure goes away. The congestion clears up. The sinus headaches stop. Not because we fixed your sinuses, there's nothing to fix, but because we addressed the nerve inflammation that was causing the symptoms in the first place. So if you have been told that you have chronic sinus issues alongside your migraines, I want you to consider this. What if it's not actually your sinuses? What if it's your trigeminal nerve responding to chronic inflammation? And what if instead of another round of antibiotics or sinus surgery, you addressed the inflammation driving the whole problem? That's what we do, and that's what works. Now, if you want to learn more about the hidden triggers fueling your inflammation, including the ones that might be affecting your trigeminal nerve, download my free guide, Toxic Migraine Triggers. It will walk you through the 6 inflammation pathways that keep migraines alive, including the ones that most doctors, they never mention to you. The link's in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next week.